The Medici.
Chapter 13. Giovanni, Leo X.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Giovanni, Leo X. Born 1476. Pope 1513 to 1521. Died 1521. Leo X was by no means so important a character as it has been universally the fashion to depict him. The splendor which surrounded him has caught the popular imagination, and has prevented its being seen how little he merited the exalted view of him which has obtained general acceptance. When, however, he is brought to stand side by side with the other members of his family, this inevitably comes out. The combined effect of his desire to take life easily and his unfailing common sense, which kept him from involving himself in matters likely to lead to embarrassment and disaster, prevented him from becoming, as did his cousin Clement VII, the pivot round which the great events which took place in his time revolved. As a result, in a history of the Medici family, where each individual occupies the place demanded by his own character and deeds, the narrative of Leo's life becomes of far less importance than that of his much less pleasing cousin Clement, who not only played a more important part in the affairs of Europe, but also pursued a course which had infinitely greater effect on the subsequent fortunes of the family. Giovanni, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was only 37 when, on the 11th March, 1513, he was elected Pope. During the previous 20 years, from the time when at 16 he had left his home in Florence to take his seat for the first time in the Sacred College, his life had been a checkered one. Returning to Florence after only a few months in Rome, he had, during the 2 years that followed, seen the rapidly increasing unpopularity of his family under his brother Pietro's unsympathetic rule, had been driven forth with him into exile, had spent 5 years in endeavors at various courts to obtain assistance for his brother in military enterprises against Florence, which invariably failed, and then, departing from Italy for a time, had wandered through northern Europe, seeing many cities and the life of many lands. Returning at length to Rome, he had gradually won for himself and his family a position of favor with the Pope, and had been sent by him on important missions, had been placed practically in command of a military force, had taken part in a severely fought battle and been taken prisoner, had seen the terrible sack of Prato and done something to mitigate its horrors, and finally had re-entered his native city in triumph, and re-established his family in power there. All this had given him a wide experience of men and affairs, but it had not altered his ease-loving disposition. Leo X gave his name to his age, and his 9 years' reign as Pope has been extolled to the skies by the literary men of 3 centuries. His character has in part been already noted. Apart from his love of literature and art, an unusually strong common sense and a genial good nature were his chief characteristics. Erasmus, who knew him well, praises his kindness and humanity, his magnanimity and learning, the charm of his manner, and his love of peace and the fine arts, and comparing his pontificate with that which had preceded it, says that an age of iron was suddenly transformed into one of gold. And even Sarpi states, Leo, noble by birth and culture, brought many aptitudes to the papacy, especially a remarkable knowledge of classical literature, humanity, kindness, the greatest liberality, and an avowed intention of supporting artists and learned men, who for many years had enjoyed no such favor in the Holy See. While Dr. Krauss says, paramount in Leo's character were his gentleness and cheerfulness, his indulgence both for himself and others, his love of peace and hatred of war. But on his personal character the great blot must rest that he passed his life in intellectual self-indulgence, and took his pleasure in hunting and amusement, while the Teutonic North was bursting the bounds of reverence and authority which bound Europe to Rome. On becoming Pope, Leo at once actively began all that encouragement of literature and art for which his pontificate is famous, inviting learned men from all parts of Italy to Rome, making plans for founding a great university there for the study of the Greek and Latin authors, corresponding with Aldus Manutius and others about inaugurating a printing press at Rome, commencing research work to obtain lost manuscripts of the classical age, planning schemes for important works to be executed by Raphael and other artists, and setting himself in every way to advance the cause of learning and art. He also set about assuring the future of his family. He created as cardinals his two first cousins, Giulio de Medici and Luigi Rossi, also his nephews, each a son of one of his three married sisters, Innocenzio Cibo, Giovanni Salviati, and Niccolò Ridolfi. With 5 cardinals in the family, there would be a good probability that one of them would succeed him as pope. His schemes for securing to the family the Duchy of Urbino have already been noted. In January 1515, Francis I, on succeeding to the French throne, began to make preparations for an expedition to recover Milan. Leo X endeavored to oppose this by means of an alliance between himself, Ferdinand of Spain, and the Emperor Maximilian. But Francis gained the victory of Marignano and took Milan, and Leo was forced to come to terms with him, which were settled at a personal conference between them, held at Bologna in December 1515. On his way to this conference, Leo stayed 3 days in Florence, where a splendid reception was prepared for him. Landucci, who was present, states that the grandeur of this reception was beyond description, and that no other city in the world would or could have done the like. The city was decorated in all directions with triumphal arches, imitations of buildings of the classic age, statues, and allegorical devices. In the Piazza della Signoria an octagonal temple was erected by San Gallo. Over the unfinished façade of the Duomo, the design for it, made by Lorenzo the Magnificent himself, was executed in wood by Sansovino and painted by Andrea del Sarto. A colossal Hercules for the Loggia de' Lanzi was sculptured by Baccio Bandinelli. Various triumphal arches were erected by Montelusso, Rosso, and Granacci, one between the Badia and the Bargello, and another near the monastery of San Marco, being specially fine. And the city gave itself up to welcoming with numerous festivities the first Florentine who had ever sat on the papal throne. On his return from Bologna, Leo stayed at Florence for more than a month, remaining there till the 17th February 1516, and during this visit he made arrangements for completing the family church of San Lorenzo. He ordered Michelangelo to prepare a design for the façade, and sent him to Carrara to obtain the necessary marble. And for this purpose no less than 34 shiploads of marble were subsequently dispatched to Florence, though the façade remains to this day untouched. Leo also directed the construction by Michelangelo of the new sacristy in San Lorenzo, which the Pope intended should form a mausoleum to contain 6 tombs, those of his father, Lorenzo, and his uncle, Giuliano, as well as tombs for the other 4 members of the family who were then living, viz., himself, his brother Giuliano, his cousin Giulio, and his nephew Lorenzo. But only 2 of these 6 tombs were ever completed. In 1516 Leo X, immediately upon his brother Giuliano's death, seized Urbino, as previously mentioned, in order to form a sovereignty for his nephew Lorenzo. The dissatisfaction caused by this procedure led, in the spring of 1517, to a remarkable episode. A serious conspiracy, headed by the young Cardinal of Siena, Alfonso Petrucci, was formed amongst the cardinals to poison the Pope. This being discovered, Petrucci, who had absented himself from Rome, was invited thither under a safe conduct, as well as a solemn promise given by Leo to the Spanish ambassador that Petrucci's life would be spared. both of which promises were disregarded as soon as the latter reached Rome, where he was thrown into prison and condemned to death. Further examination proved that a large number of cardinals were implicated in the plot, and Petrucci with his two chief assistants, a surgeon and a secretary, were cruelly tortured and put to death. The lives of the other cardinals concerned were spared, but they were subjected to various deprivations. These punishments aroused so great disaffection among nearly all the remaining cardinals that the Pope had to be surrounded by guards even when celebrating Mass in St. Peter's. To meet this alarming state of affairs, and finally put an end to this extraordinary episode, Leo X took the bold and unprecedented step of creating in one day 31 new cardinals. At this period, just before the Reformation, the plurality of offices held by the higher clergy was scandalous. Roscoe states, "It is actually and substantially true that the same person was frequently at the same time an archbishop in Germany, a bishop in France or England, an abbot or a prior in Poland or Spain, and a cardinal in Rome." The creation of so many additional cardinals, with the benefices given to them, of course increased this evil, and this large number of important church offices held by permanent absentees, tending as it did to much corruption and maladministration in the diocese, thus deprived of their proper rulers, helped to increase the dissatisfaction with the Church which was steadily growing in Northern Europe. In 1518, Leo X arranged with Francis I the marriage already mentioned between his nephew Lorenzo and the king's relative, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, this being the second matrimonial alliance with the royal family of France made by the Medici family. When in the following year Lorenzo died, Leo sent his cousin Giulio to administer Florentine affairs for a time. The latter remained in Florence from May to October 1519. And on his return to Rome, Cardinal Passerini was left in charge of the Medicean interests in Florence on behalf of the Pope, and continued in charge for the next 2 years. In 1521, Perugia being greatly misgoverned by its ruler, Gianpaolo Baglioni, described as a monster of iniquity, Leo X determined to put an end to the Baglioni rule there, and to incorporate Perugia with the States of the Church. He seems to have considered that against such a criminal any treachery was admissible. Baglioni was invited to Rome under the pretext of consulting with him about political affairs, and given the Pope's safe conduct, but on arrival was thrown into prison, subjected to torture, and beheaded in the castle of Sant'Angelo, the Pope taking possession of Perugia. About the same time, a similarly treacherous endeavour was made to enlarge still further the States of the Church by seizing Ferrara, but the agents who had been bribed to open the gates on the approach of the Papal forces revealed the plot to the Duke of Ferrara, and the attempt failed. Even Roscoe, with all his admiration for Leo X, remarks that these operations disclose some of the darkest shades of his character. And they are to be attributed, if not wholly, at all events to a very large extent, to that action which was the fundamental mistake of Leo X's life. For in order to satisfy his easygoing temperament, and indulge in those pursuits of literature and art, convivial pleasures, and luxurious enjoyment, for which alone he cared, Leo surrendered the whole conduct of the political affairs of the papacy into the hands of his energetic and crafty cousin Giulio, with the consequences which were to be expected from the latter's unscrupulous character. Leo X must, of course, bear the full responsibility for the acts which he permitted to be done in his name; but while this is so, the political acts of his pontificate are to be ascribed rather to Giulio than to Giovanni, and in looking at the latter's life and character this requires to be borne in mind. To him, political and ecclesiastical affairs were a wearisome burden to be got rid of as much as possible, while as time went on he left them more and more in the hands that were so willing to undertake them, leaving him free to attend to those matters which to him were so much more congenial. It was indeed hard on such a nature that it should be his lot to have to deal with a movement like the Reformation, and be expected to divert his attention from the latest reproduction of some classical work brought out by Aldo's printing press to give heed to the troublesome complaints of a Luther. It is almost as much a relief to us as it must have been to Leo himself to turn from his political life to his action in regard to those matters which were his chief interest. Here we find another man altogether, and here there is neither apathy, boredom, surrender of his leadership to others, nor treacherous or underhand dealing. In that world of literature and art which his soul loved, and in his sympathy for all the culture of his time, he is worthy of that atmosphere of splendor which is gathered round his name. His great-grandfather Cosimo and his father Lorenzo had contrived both to conduct difficult political affairs and also to achieve mighty results in the domain of literature and art. Leo X had none of the energy of his ancestors, while his abilities were cast in a smaller mold, so that he found one half of the matter as much as he could attend to. But in that half his achievements, though not to be compared to those of his father and great-grandfather, were considerable. Moreover, he had greater resources to draw upon. Art had advanced to its zenith. Great stores of the classical literature had by this time been brought to light. Printing had come to assist in their reproduction, instead of the slow and laborious process of hand copying. While great as had been the wealth which his ancestors had possessed to assist their efforts in this cause, Leo had the still greater resources of the papacy. To detail all that he did in the patronage of literature and art would fill a volume. The same effect was produced at Rome as had taken place 80 years before at Florence, where his great-grandfather Cosimo became the leading man in that city. Scholars and artists flocked to Rome, where such a patron was to be found. Leo founded the University of Rome, to which he summoned a crowd of celebrated men, and which had 88 professors as teachers of various branches of learning; and he did not rest until he had, with the assistance of Marcus Masurus and Aldus Manutius, established a press at Rome for printing the works of the great authors, which, as they issued, were corrected by the celebrated Giovanni Lascaris himself, who had in his earlier years been employed in the researches of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and whom Leo now summoned to Rome to help him in this work. Ariosto speaks in glowing terms of the gifted company of poets and learned men whom Leo gathered round him. His own classical attainments were considerable, and he was justly acknowledged as a judge on all such matters. He had a passion for all books and manuscripts, both in the dead and living languages, and these he devoured with avidity, remembering and quoting their contents out of an excellent memory. Towards art his patronage was unbounded, and great as was his renown, it has been held by many that his protection of, and affection for, Raphael, who died the year before him, is, and always will be, Leo's best and noblest title to fame. The above pursuits were combined with all the amusements of an existence frankly given up to enjoying life as much as possible, and never showing from first to last any indication that a future life was to be expected. This latter is a strange trait under the circumstances, and one which had very important results. Lorenzo the Magnificent, for all his love of the pagan classical literature, and whatever he may or may not have been in conduct, never displayed this trait; but in the son whom he had helped to become head of the Church it is a marked feature, and various eminent writers have supported the opinion of Mosheim in designating Leo X as an atheist. Not that he was by any means wanting as regards to the outward performance of his religious duties, for as to these he was most scrupulous. But both Europe in that age and Mohammedan countries in our own can show plenty of examples that the scrupulous performance of such duties is compatible with entire unbelief. So far as one can judge, on so essentially private a matter, from a man's outward conduct and expressed opinions, Leo was a simple Epicurean pagan. He was not a coarse voluptuary, but his speech on becoming pope frankly displayed his mind. "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And he did. Hunting and hawking parties in the Campagna, pleasant gatherings at his villa of La Magliana, convivial supper parties at Rome, the delights of literature, poetry, music, and theatrical representations, a revelry of culture as Gregorovius has called it, these things occupied the greater portion of his time. Unlike most scholars or any previous pope, Leo was greatly devoted to sport, as understood in those days, and often spent a month or more at a time absent from the papal city, either fishing or pheasant shooting round the lake of Bolsena, or staying at his favorite hunting lodge of La Magliana, 5 miles from Rome, in the fever-laden valley of the Tiber, taking part in the grand battues of stags, wild boar, and every sort of game, and scandalizing the papal master of ceremonies by appearing in hunting costume, and worst of all, in long riding boots. When in Rome his life was a less healthy one. The Venetian ambassador at his court has described the ponderous and unwholesome banquets, lasting for hours, and in their lavish profusion and variety of incongruous dishes, reminding us of the feasts of the Roman emperors of antiquity. And Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, who was the Pope's guest during the winter of 1514, has graphically detailed how she and her maids of honor were plunged into a perpetual round of banquets, balls, processions, hunting parties, popular festivals, and dramatic performances. Occupied in this constant succession of festivities, field sports, and literary and artistic delights, Leo led an easy, jovial existence, troubling himself as little as might be with political affairs, and leaving the heavier burdens of the papacy, whose course was at that epoch becoming from day to day more thickly strewn with rocks and shoals, to be borne by his cousin Giulio. In 1515 the Emperor Maximilian's grandson Charles, then 15, was invested with the government of Flanders, his father Philip having died in 1506. His genealogy is important, and was as follows: Maximilian of Austria married Mary of Burgundy, only child of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. They gave birth to Philip, Archduke of Austria, and heir of Flanders through his mother. Philip married Joanna, Queen of Spain and Naples, and the daughter of Ferdinand, King of Aragon, and Isabella, Queen of Castile, and sister to Catherine, married to Henry VIII of England. Philip and Joanna gave birth to Charles V, married to Isabella, daughter of the King of Portugal. Ferdinand, King of Bohemia. Eleonora married 1. the King of Portugal, and 2. Francis I of France, and Mary, married to Louis, King of Hungary. In 1516 Ferdinand of Spain died, and Charles was invested with the government of Spain and Naples in place of his mother Joanna, who was set aside, being mad. In the same year the 8 Years' War, begun by the League of Cambrai, was brought to an end by the Treaty of Noyeux between Francis and Charles, which left France in possession of Lombardy, and Spain in possession of Naples and Sicily. In 1519 the Emperor Maximilian died, and Charles succeeded to the crown of Austria and Flanders. There ensued 5 months' rivalry between Francis I of France, Henry VIII of England, and Charles of Austria, as to which of them should be elected emperor. Finally, Charles was elected. Thus Charles V inherited Austria from his grandfather Maximilian, Flanders from his grandmother Mary of Burgundy, Spain and Naples from his grandfather Ferdinand and his grandmother Isabella, and the imperial title, with such dominions as still remained to it, by the election of the German Diet. The result of his election as emperor was a contest between the 3 rivals which lasted for 28 years, in which Francis and Charles were always opponents, and Henry sided sometimes with one and sometimes with the other. In 1520 Charles V visited Henry VIII in England in May, and in June Francis I and Henry VIII held the meeting known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold to cement their friendship. In 1521, Francis declared war against Charles, invading simultaneously Luxembourg from one side of France and Navarre from the other. Henry, led by Wolsey, sided with Charles. The atmosphere of cultured paganism which Leo X created around him in the Vatican was unique, and it has been too well described by Ranke to be given in any other words. He says: "At that time men sought to emulate the ancients in their own language. Leo X was an especial patron of this pursuit. He read the well-written introduction to the history of Jovius, Volume I, 2d, aloud in his circle of intimates, declaring that since the works of Livy nothing so good had been produced. A patron of the Latin improvisators, we may readily conceive the charm he would find in the talents of Vida, who could set forth a subject like a game of chess in the full tones of well-cadenced Latin hexameters. A mathematician, celebrated for expounding his science in elegant Latin, was invited from Portugal. In this manner he, Leo, would have had theology and church history written. It was in his presence that the first tragedy was performed, and also the first comedy produced in the Italian language, and this notwithstanding the objectionable character of a play that imitated Plautus. Ariosto was among the acquaintances of his youth. Machiavelli composed more than one of his works expressly for him. His halls, galleries, and chapels were filled by Raphael with the rich ideal of human beauty. He was a passionate lover of music, and its sounds were daily heard floating through the palace, Leo himself humming the airs performed. Easily does life veil its own incongruities. Such a state of things was directly opposed to Christian sentiment and conviction. The schools of philosophy disputed as to whether the soul were really immortal or whether it were absolutely mortal. Nor are we to believe that these opinions were confined to a few. Erasmus declares himself astonished at the blasphemies that met his ears. Attempts were made to prove to him, a foreigner, by passages from Pliny, that the souls of men are absolutely identical with those of beasts. Such was the atmosphere in which Leo X passed his life as Pope. And if this mode of life was less objectionable than that which had distinguished some of his immediate predecessors, it was not less at variance with the urgent needs of the circumstances of the time. For a storm was beginning to gather north of the Alps, destined in no long time to envelop all Europe, and to give the papacy other things to think of than light literature and the triumphs of art. The papacy had fallen to one who neither outraged the world by crime and immorality, like Sixtus IV and Alexander VI, nor harassed mankind by perpetual war, like Julius II. But the causes which had long been tending towards a revolt from the papacy were still steadily at work, and, as the results of the invention of printing increased, were ever gathering greater strength. Printing presses did not only reproduce the Greek and Latin works of pagan poets, and the ancient manuscripts, unearthed by ardent research, included the writings of Irenaeus and Tertullian, Cyprian and Basil, no less than those of Cicero and Pliny, Tacitus and Livy. The work of Cosimo and Lorenzo was now about to produce results which they had never anticipated. The new learning was no longer confined to Florence or to Italy. It had spread far and wide, carrying with it to Germany, to Flanders, to Switzerland, to France, and to England the knowledge of the fraudulent basis on which the papal claim to supremacy in the Church rested, the knowledge of a Christian age in which there had been no papacy, and all bishops had been of equal rank and authority, and the knowledge of a pre-existing scheme of Christian doctrine not overlaid by the errors and corruptions which had subsequently grown up in the Church at Rome. And as this knowledge spread, wider and stronger grew the determination to end the existing state of things in the Church, to cast off the usurped supremacy of Rome, and to return to a purer form of Christianity. Not that the Roman Church is to be justly charged with all that her opponents asserted. The power developed by the papacy had, in its time, done great things for religion. During a large part of the earlier Middle Ages, the papacy was the sole authority in Europe which stood for justice and righteousness, and had it not possessed the power it gradually developed, it would have been unable to withstand effectively, as it did, the almost universal unrighteousness in high places. But that time was long past, and for at least 2 centuries the papacy had only made use of its power for purposes of worldly aggrandizement, with results that caused the condemnation which it incurred to be fully deserved. The gradual spread of this newly acquired knowledge, following on the failure of all efforts to obtain reform by means of a general council, had by degrees made men ready, as soon as opportunity should occur, to fly to arms to obtain that reform which it was evident was to be gained in no other way. This effect had been steadily growing during the pontificate of Sixtus IV, Innocent VIII, Alexander VI, Julius II, and Leo X. But so little did these popes realize the conditions of the case, that they seemed, by the kind of life they led, bent upon bringing about that appeal to arms. They were bishops of the leading see of Western Christendom, yet anything more opposed to the ideal life of a bishop, whether measured by the standard of the earliest centuries of the Church's life, or by that of our own age, than were their lives, it would be hard to conceive. And so the natural result followed in a conflagration which brought cruel wars and innumerable sufferings upon mankind, and tore the civilized world asunder for 150 years, but in the end cleansed Christendom. And here we come upon one of those strange revelations, impossible for anyone at the time to have seen, but which history, throwing its light back upon events long past, every now and then shows to those who come afterwards. From the time of Cosimo we see 4 successive generations of the Medici, the very last family to wish to bring about such a movement as the Reformation, and the very family out of which were to come the 2 popes who were the leading opponents of that movement, eagerly engaged in pursuing a course which made them, little as they dreamt it, the chief agents in producing that great revolt from the papacy. For it was not Luther, but the new learning which produced the Reformation. A very little consideration will show that no single individual, much less one placed in so obscure a position as Luther, could have produced a convulsion which shook all Europe from end to end. What Luther did was to set light to materials which were ready to take fire. And this new learning was created, nourished, fostered, and endowed chiefly by the Medici. It is strange indeed to note what energy they devoted, and what wealth they expended, through a period of 80 years, on that which was to bring upon the papacy such dire results. And to do so during the very time that the papal throne was occupied by the 2 members of this family who in turn sat upon it. Of the 5 popes who have been named, Leo X was the one against whom mankind had by far the fewest accusations to bring. It was, however, his fate to take the action which finally precipitated the crisis. The legacy which Julius II had left him, of building a new St. Peter's, caused such a heavy drain on the resources of the papacy, that it became necessary to find some unusual means for raising funds. Accordingly, in 1517 Leo published a bull, declaring that the Pope has the power of granting indulgences affecting the state of souls after death, and that this doctrine was an essential article of belief. And this was followed by the scandalous measure of the sale of these indulgences, thus starting a traffic in holy things which roused Northern Europe to a pitch of indignation such as even the crimes of Alexander VI had failed to call forth. Obviously, one who doubted whether souls were immortal would find no difficulty in declaring his power to grant such indulgences, or in selling them to anyone who would give money for them. And it is very probable that Leo felt astonished at the uproar which his action aroused. Upon the issue of this bull by the Pope, Luther published and nailed up on the door of the principal church at Wittenberg his celebrated theses against both the sale of indulgences and all the additions which had been made to the theory and practice of indulgences during the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, with all they involved. The system of indulgences, with the doctrines on which it was based, was no new invention of Leo X. It had existed for at least 300 years, and Leo only redeclared it. But the new learning had caused the temper of men's minds to change, and the new departure of the sale of such indulgences came just when men were least disposed to endure it. The conflagration quickly spread. Germany was soon in a blaze, and Flanders and Switzerland showed signs of following suit. Luther proceeded to rouse all men against the iniquities of the papacy, and to urge the assembly of a general council to purge the Church; and at length, in June 1520, he published his celebrated Appeal to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. 4,000 copies were distributed with the greatest rapidity, the printers working while Luther wrote, and it immediately produced a strong impression throughout Germany. At the same time, from the other side, Leo published in all countries his bull of 1520, condemning the doctrines of Luther, calling upon all princes and peoples to seize him and his adherents, and excommunicating all who might harbor them. This bull Luther, protected by the Elector of Saxony, publicly and solemnly burnt at Wittenberg. And so began a conflict which was to last for generations, splitting countries, nations, and even families asunder, and having far-reaching effects which are still extending. In the following year, Leo, anxious to drive the French out of Italy, deserted Francis and engaged to join Charles in an attempt to regain Milan. The imperial and papal forces were commanded by the Marquis of Pescara, and in November 1521 Milan was captured. The news reached Leo at his villa of La Magliana at the 22nd November, and filled him with the greatest joy. But the same evening he caught a chill on returning hot and tired from the chase, fever set in, he returned to the Vatican, grew rapidly worse, and died on 1st December. There was, as usual, a suspicion that his death was due to poison, and Castiglione, who was with him at Magliana, at first believed this, but the post-mortem examination which was held failed to confirm the suspicion. And in view of the excessively malarious character of the locality of Magliana, nothing could be more probable than that malarial fever contracted at the place where he so often resided should eventually be the cause of his death. Leo X was 45 when he died. He was buried at first in the Vatican. The result of Julius II's action in regard to St. Peter's was that neither he himself nor any of the 3 popes after him could be buried there, and for several years no tomb was erected to Leo X. But after the death of Clement VII, 1534, it was decided that these 2 Medici popes should be interred in the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, whereupon Cardinal Ippolito de Medici removed Leo X's remains from the Vatican to that church, and commenced the erection of the tombs of the 2 Medici popes, Leo X and Clement VII, which are to be seen there. After Ippolito's untimely death in 1535, these tombs were completed by Leo X's sister, Lucrezia Salviati. It would have been hard if the Medici, the greatest of all patrons of art, and belonging to art's own special home, Florence, should not have been able to show us a unique succession of portraits of themselves, executed by the leading painters of their day. And in Leo X's case, none other could of course be employed to paint his portrait than his own great protégé and favourite, Raphael. And so Raphael has given us one of the most celebrated portraits in existence, that of Leo X with his 2 first cousins, Giulio de Medici and Luigi Rossi, which hangs in the Pitti Gallery. And it tells us much of Raphael's own character to note that even though he is entirely dependent upon this great patron, yet he will not flatter him, and we feel that we have the man to the life placed before us. Easy-going, jovial, indolent, luxury-loving, shrewd, and worldly wise, all this he was, and just so does Raphael depict him. His tendency to fat was not altogether his fault. He had it throughout life, and endeavored to combat it by outdoor pursuits, and it was on the advice of his physicians that he carried these on even after he became pope, notwithstanding the shock that it gave to the ideas held by the papal officials as to what was becoming in a pope. His love of learning is indicated in the picture by the book which he has just been studying, his love of all forms of art, both by the illuminations of the book and by the highly chased silver bell, and his indifferent eyesight, which was proverbial, by the spectacles and the magnifying glass, which latter Jovius says he used on all occasions. Of the two cardinals shown with him, Giulio is the one standing at the right hand of the Pope, who seems to be listening to his advice, their respective attitudes through life. Giulio's clever and intelligent, yet cold, hard face is probably a much better likeness of him than that afterwards painted by Andrea del Sarto. Luigi Rossi was the Pope's secretary. The picture is not only notable for its portraiture, but also as a wonderful study of the combination of colors, the whole, except the Pope's white robe, being in various shades of crimson and red. Exaltation to the papacy is probably the severest trial to character which this world holds, and it was one which Leo was not able to bear. A steady deterioration in his character from the time that he became pope is the most marked feature in him. Many cited, like all his family, he was a remarkable mixture of good and bad points, but in the end the latter predominated.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.